Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's Meet the Analyst webinar, Commerce Media, How Retail Media is Evolving into an Even Bigger Opportunity. I'm your host, Paul Verna, Principal Analyst at Insider Intelligence in New York, and I'm joined by my colleague, Principal Analyst Andrew Lipsman in Chicago. Hi, Andrew, great to have you here.
Hey, Paul, great to be with you.
Before we get into the main presentation, I'd like to thank Criteo for making today's webinar possible, and I'd like to welcome Brian Gleason, Chief Revenue Officer at Criteo. Brian recently joined Criteo from Group M, where he held leadership positions for more than 5 years, most recently as Global Chief Commercial Officer. Brian is joining us from New York. Hi, Brian.
Hey, Paul. Great to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
A few things before we dive in. We have a ton of information to share, but there's no need to take notes. We'll email you a link to view the slides and the full recording. But we do want you to participate, so just use the chat window on the right to submit questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A. So with that, Andrew, let's get started. What's on the agenda for today?
Thanks, Paul. So we're going to talk about commerce media and how this extension of retail media is evolving into an even bigger opportunity. So I'm going to take you through what commerce media is and provide some definition around that. Then I'm going to talk about how it's actually evolving across a number of dimensions, from bottom funnel ads, namely search, into upper funnel advertising opportunities, from digital and e-commerce into a bigger in-store opportunity. And then lastly, from retailers who are primarily driving retail media today into a wider swath of commerce players. I'll wrap it all up with what's next for commerce media. So with that, let's jump into it. So the commerce media opportunity. Let's start and ground the conversation in retail media as it exists today. So if you think about it along a couple of dimensions, we have the advertising format. And here on this y-axis, you see it goes from bottom funnel to upper funnel. And then the sales channel, and it goes from online to in-store. Now, today, retail media is predominantly existing in the bottom funnel, search specifically, and it's e-commerce driven. These are the ads that you're seeing on retailer websites. This square, or this rectangle that we're seeing, is about 90% of the opportunity today. So this is largely where the market exists currently. But it's evolving quickly across both of these dimensions. We are moving into more upper funnel ad formats. That's about the other 10% of what we're seeing today. And then we're in the very early stages of seeing the opportunity evolve across sales channels into in-store. Huge opportunity that is in front of us, but only in the very beginning stages of materializing. But wait, there's more. It's actually evolving across a third dimension. As I mentioned, it's largely retailers who are in the retail media market today, but there are a whole range of different commerce providers out there, transactions that are happening in 3 dimensions, in the real world, in the physical world, all around us. And so there are so many other potential players who are starting to dabble in the market as well. So if you really look at the opportunity as it exists today and where it's going across these 3 dimensions, you see just how big of an opportunity commerce media actually is. So one way I've tried to illustrate the growth and potential of the market today is to look at retail media as digital advertising's third wave. So in this case, we have visualized the major digital advertising markets over a long period of time. The first one that obviously brought budgets online in a big way was search. Search really kind of dominated that influx of ad dollars to online from 2000 to 2010. The next decade really was dominated by the growth of social, 2010 to 2020. And you can see how that market progressed. But more recently, we've seen the ascent of retail media in red. And this next decade, really from 2020 to 2030, it may extend well beyond that, but we are really getting into the thick of the retail media era as it exists today. So it's come a long way already, lots more to come. Why is retail media such a thing? Well, it fills a really huge need for brands. We are sitting at the intersection of some of the most massive marketing dislocations that have happened in years. A lot of very stable markets in marketing and commerce are now being disrupted. So the first one, that big $70 billion pool of linear TV advertising dollars, that's being disrupted by the fact that TV viewing patterns are migrating to other channels, to connected TV. Ratings are in decline. It's harder and harder to get reach from traditional demographics. The second one is what we're seeing in digital advertising today, which really manifested this week again with earnings season with Google and Facebook. The deprecation of third-party identifiers and the privacy era that we're in now, behavioral advertising is being disrupted. There is a need for that first-party data that retail media provides. The last piece, one that I think has enormous potential and isn't really talked about quite yet, is what's happening in stores. We have the digitization of the store, and that's going to really grow as you bring digital experiences and the best parts of e-commerce into the store environment. So let's take a fresh look at the retail media market. Our latest forecast just came out a couple of weeks ago, and here's what it says. So this year, we expect retail media in the US to be about a $40 billion market. Now, the last couple of years, really coming out of the pandemic, we saw these just enormous growth rates, about 50% year over year over the last 2 years. Those growth rates are going to start to come down just a little bit, still pretty high in the 30 and 20% range. But if you look across this forecast, you can see that almost like clockwork, year after year, it's about $10 billion in new incremental spending in retail media each and every year. So there's a lot more to come. Between 2021 and 2024, that market's going to double from about 30 billion to over 60 billion.
Andrew, seeing this chart and hearing you talk about $10 billion increments every year, I can't help thinking about that $10 billion figure being cited again and again. First, we heard that in the second half of 2021, some of the big social platforms like Meta and Snap had about an estimated 10 billion of losses as a result of Apple's privacy changes, which you mentioned. Then we heard the IAB estimating that about 10 billion in sell-side revenue was at stake. And then at the beginning of this year, we heard Meta estimate that they would lose about 10 billion this year. So 10 billion here, 10 billion there, and pretty much, pretty soon you're talking about some real money, right? So just wondering how all these $10 billion chunks interconnect, or is it just a cosmic coincidence?
Yeah, it's a lot of dollars up for grabs, right? I think that's the main takeaway. It would be nice and clean if that $10 billion headwind that Facebook has noted is funneling straight into retail media. I've looked at quite a bit of evidence. It's moving into a lot of directions. Actually, Google is kind of an immediate beneficiary, but certainly it's moving into other channels like TikTok, retail media, although there's not always the most overlap between brands who are advertising on Facebook and Amazon or other retail media offerings, though there certainly is a fair amount. So it's probably a few billion of that, but not that 10 billion chunk. So where's the growth in retail media coming from? Here we're comparing it to search and social, this data coming from Sky. And I'll start with the other two first. So search, you can see in Q4 grew 23%. That growth was basically all price driven, right? So it's a mature market, not necessarily more inventory or impressions happening, all price. Social, actually in a direction you don't necessarily want to be going in. The growth that's happening is more modest, and it's driven purely by price. In fact, that implies that the impressions or clicks are actually declining. Retail media is healthier. It's what you want to see. There's nice steady growth. Some of it is price driven in this environment, but it means a lot of it is that there's more inventory and more impressions opening up. So that's good for both the sell side and the buy side. So where are the budgets going to pull from in the future? This BCG analysis, with roughly aligns with our forecast and our thinking, says that $74 billion will be coming into the market over the next 5 years. So by 2026, where are those pools of spending coming in? The biggest one is organic growth in digital spend. And we've really seen that trend consistent over the last several years. But the next big piece is the shift in trade budgets. All that offline spending, shopper marketing, trade spend is a big piece of what's going to come into retail media. Shift from other digital channels. So a lot of that will be coming out of Facebook or other social, and then traditional media will make up the rest of that share. So the market as it exists today, I think it's fair to say it's dominated by Amazon. You can see Amazon's market share way up at the top, well into the high 70% range. Amazon, listen, they created this market. They made retail media into what it is today. Doesn't mean there's not quite a bit of opportunity for everyone else. This is going to be a big market, and really each percentage point of this market, if you think about it, represents roughly $500 million in spending. So there's a lot of opportunity. The next biggest players, Walmart, eBay, Instacart among them. Walmart is going to have about 6% of the market, on its way to 8%, and the others, in the 1% to 2% range. So this is the market as it exists today. But again, there is a lot of opportunity for anybody who carves out even a modest slice of this market. But it's not all about Amazon. So that opportunity that I was mentioning, here we're looking at Instacart and Walmart in comparison to Amazon. So Amazon has attracted these budgets really quickly. It's gotten hyper competitive. You go on Amazon, you know how many sponsored impressions you see on an average search. As it's gotten more competitive, return on ad spend has started to come down. In fact, comparing back to Q4 of 2020, about modest single-digit declines in that return on ad spend. It's still pretty high in relation to other formats, but it's coming down. At the same time, Walmart and Instacart, those return on ad spend numbers are going up quite a bit, 20, 30%. So that's a growing opportunity if you're trying to think about where should my next dollar go. Maybe it's that second and third platform. But there's only so many platforms that most brands can manage. This research from the Trade Desk shows how many retail media networks are currently being used by US marketers. And you can see the vast majority of them, it's really 2 or 3 platforms. And after that, it falls off quite a bit. So 86% of brands kind of hit that limit at a third platform. This is pretty consistent with what we see everywhere with the emergence of digital ad markets. There's only so many players and walled gardens you can use at once, and it gets incrementally harder to manage each one after that. So this says that the market is likely going to see more aggregation, consolidation, partnerships, things that make it easier for the buy side to buy across more opportunities in one shot rather than having to work independently with each individual walled garden. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 dimensions that I mentioned. So the first one is this progression from the bottom of the funnel to the upper funnel. So in retail media, I say this in general. I always say, instead of thinking about it in terms of branding versus performance, why not both? I do think that really good advertising can have a branding impact that drives behavior over time, not necessarily right away, while also driving some near-term performance. So I think that's what, in thinking about retail media, brands should be aspiring to. That said, we've had really a laser focus in recent years on performance advertising when it comes to digital. Branding's not going anywhere. It's still the majority of ad budgets, according to this study, and even was growing by a couple of percentage points from 2020 to 2021. So branding isn't going away. It's increasingly a big part of the retail media opportunity. And I think that brands need to think about how it fits into that equation. So how are they doing that? They are starting to buy across a lot of upper funnel ad formats. We did our own research on a retail media networks benchmark, and we asked retail media ad buyers what types of formats did they buy within the last 12-month period. Now, search was the highest on the list, but not by a long shot. Now, it does get a disproportionate amount of budgets, but what we saw is that these retail media ad buyers are buying into on-site display and banner, connected TV, on-site and off-site video and display ads. So all that's upper funnel and not far behind what you're seeing with search. They're also, interestingly, about a half of them are buying in-store media as well. So I mentioned the digitization of the store is a big opportunity. These formats will come into play, I think, a lot more in coming years. So again, as Amazon goes, so goes the retail media market. Amazon really for a few years now has been pushing the industry to move up the funnel. Their bread is buttered with search, but they know that their future needs to be more and more about that upper funnel advertising. And so they've really pushed, actually this analysis looks at what their content on the Amazon ads blog focused on, which ad formats. And you can see that video is at the top, followed by Amazon DSP, which is representing, display and video ads online largely, and then sponsored display. Really, sponsored products is 10%. Almost everything else here is upper funnel advertising. So that is really what Amazon has focused on, and it's working. And I think it's being successful at starting to court those big brand dollars.
Andrew, you mentioned the Amazon DSP, and I couldn't help remembering there's an advertiser's perception study that came out recently looking at the average number of DSPs that marketers and agencies used in the past 2 years. And that number was pretty steady at 3.4. The number that they plan to use this year jumped up to almost 6. So I'm wondering if there's a correlation between retail media networks and, particularly Amazon's DSP and this rise in the average number of DSPs.
There's so many platforms out there, right? If you can be a big player, there's a lot to gain. So I understand it. And there's more and more need for marketers to spread their dollars across more platforms. It does get hard. I mean, I think we're seeing, similar trends happening with the DSP proliferation and retail media network proliferation. But they do reach their limits. So even though I think the capacity is probably growing and they're going to take on more platforms, it's not infinite. So I do think we need to be thinking, and brands need to be thinking about where do you place those bets, or how can you get access to inventory that cuts across different types of formats and different types of networks. So this data comes from Perpetua. It's an analysis of Amazon advertising. And I think it's really interesting to show how retail media can be truly full funnel, driving both branding and performance. So I'll walk you through what we're looking at here. This is basically how long does it take between an ad exposure and conversion for different types of ad formats. At the top, we have sponsored products, which is search. And how long did it take to convert? About 3/4 of the time, it's within 2 hours. That makes sense. There's a very tight closed loop between search and converting on a product. With the DSP, again, those are display and video ads online predominantly, about half and half between ads that convert within 1 day or 24 hours and longer than that. And then OTT advertising, or connected TV, that has a very different composition where very few of them convert immediately. About 3/4 of them actually convert outside of 3 days. So much more of that branding, latent impact, but it is driving performance that is measurable as well. Now, this CTV opportunity, I think, is really ready to hit its stride. So this year is a big year for it kind of achieving liftoff. And I'll talk about a couple of big initiatives happening across the industry. The first one is that Walmart, with really strong first-party sales data across channels, partnered with the Trade Desk to get access to its upper funnel inventory, including a big footprint of CTV ads. So that was one big partnership that's starting to materialize this year. A similar thing happened with Kroger partnering with Roku. And that has a big footprint of CTV ad inventory. And then Amazon, with its own play, with exclusive rights to Thursday night NFL football. That happens in the fall. Amazon also just announced that they're doing Free, which is the rebranding of IMDb TV, but it's free ad-supported CTV content. That opens up a lot more inventory. So all of this is going to start to materialize and get its feet under it this year. 2023 is probably more realistically where it scales in a significant way, but this is a big thing to watch in terms of the shift to the upper funnel. All right, let's talk now about the transition from digital to in-store. So the first thing I want to mention is that, we talk a lot about e-commerce these days, and obviously dollars are migrating to e-commerce, but in-store still makes up, depending on the category, it can be 80–90% of sales. If we look at CPG, which is a big part of the conversation in retail media today, Those key categories, which I've highlighted here, health, personal care, and beauty, 17% is e-commerce, which means the other 83% is happening in store. Food and beverage, even bigger difference, about 94% of those sales are still happening in store. So huge, huge opportunity to show the link between online ads and retail media and offline sales impact. But it hasn't really happened yet. It's just starting to materialize. And I think that highlights for me why it's such a big opportunity if you can begin to show that link. And brands say that they're struggling with this. This survey from the Trade Desk asked what challenges are impacting future marketing strategies from US marketers. And they basically all had to do with the transition between online and offline, specifically just overall adapting to the shift to online purchases. But also they're struggling with the availability and fragmentation of retail sales data as it exists in these two different silos between online and offline. And as a result of that, they can't effectively optimize these cross-channel campaigns. Think about the potential as you bring that cross-channel data, that offline data into the equation, how much things can shift and how much budgets will move along with that. We asked in our own research about the different attributes that were most important for brands with a retail media network. And the top two important ones were traffic. That's usually the starting point for being able to monetize through search ads. But very close after that was the availability of in-store and omni-channel sales data. In fact, 84% of them said that it was extremely or very important. So again, highlighting this opportunity. The fact that it's so high on the list, and again, is not being properly activated today, shows that there's a huge opportunity for whoever can help solve that problem. Already, in spite of the lack of offline sales data being brought into retail media for targeting and measurement, we are starting to see those offline budgets shift. So retail media is most likely to get funded from brand media or e-commerce media, but we saw the biggest shift between 2020 and 2021 in shopper and trade dollars moving into retail media. So I think that these are massive budgets once again, I mean, just really huge. The more that we prove that it's impacting offline spend, the more those dollars migrate and do so in faster fashion. All right, so the last section here, let's talk about the shift from a more retail-centric view of the world to a more commerce media view of the world. What does that look like? So historically, the ad dollars have come from a few categories that really are the sweet spot for retail media. I've got those kind of highlighted up at the top: retail, CPG, consumer electronics. I've plotted out all these different digital advertiser categories according to their year-over-year percent change, and then how much spending do they represent. So big and high growth is making up the most of retail media. But if we think about all of these other categories, these non-endemics, auto, telecom, financial services, travel, media, entertainment, those collectively add up to the other 50% of digital ad spend. So it's a huge, huge chunk sitting out there, and they're all growing at rates that are in excess of 10%, in some cases in the high teens as well. So, and these are 10 to $30 billion categories. So again, there's a really big opportunity just sitting out there. So non-endemic brands, they're wise to the value of first-party data, and you can see they're already tapping into retail media networks, but predominantly to do that just to get access to the data. They know that purchase data around consumers can be valuable in fueling their own campaigns and reaching the right audiences. But a shift that we saw from 2020 to 2021 is that we previously had about 20% who said they weren't engaged with retail media at all. And in that 1 year, almost all of them got off the sidelines, with those who said they considered it but didn't know how to engage, don't feel that way anymore. And then the other 5% who were saying that they never considered it, that also kind of evaporated. So almost every non-endemic is now keyed into the opportunity. The next opportunity is to get those budgets to scale. So as I think about the market today, I've historically classified retail media networks. Obviously, we've had a huge influx in the number of retail media networks today. And the first three segments that I would call out are digital marketplaces. As I mentioned, Amazon was the original, but eBay wasn't really far behind. These big marketplaces have a ton of traffic, and that's often the starting point. Then we started to see the mass merch retailers get into the game. They have large online audiences, but they also have potential with their offline footprints to leverage that data and those in-store media environments. Then we have the category focused or specialty retailers who maybe do the same thing as the mass merch, but they're more focused on the specific advertiser categories that they serve particularly well. If we think about commerce media, though, the opportunity is expanding. So we've also got this segment of commerce intermediaries. Instacart, as I mentioned before, is a really big player. Uber is another one. Uber has its own media network. In fact, one of the things that they've done to add their own physical world wrinkle into it is that they have car top ads. So they're really thinking about how they can advertise effectively to consumers. DoorDash, similar sort of thing. GoPuff, with the quick commerce delivery, what they're doing actually is pioneering product sampling as part of their advertising mix. So it really opens up some of the physical world opportunities. There's also travel and entertainment platforms. If we think about an Expedia, they know where people are going, where they're going to travel, where they're flying, what hotels they're going to stay in. All of that sort of information is really rich first-party data that can be leveraged effectively in thinking about how people travel throughout the world. Entertainment platforms like Ticketmaster, that's all about local events and entertainment, sports, et cetera. And it also has a ton of traffic that can be monetized. And then lastly, finance and payment platforms. Shopify is starting to dabble in advertising. Klarna and MasterCard, they also have some nascent offerings. What's interesting here is they have access to cross-category shopping behavior that is in really high volume. So they have a really, really deep and wide view into consumer spending patterns that potentially can be tapped to target ads really effectively across a lot of channels. So lastly, just to wrap up here, what's next for commerce media as we think about it? I just want to reiterate the importance of connected TV as really a big piece of the upper funnel media equation. We've already started to move up into display and video online, but CTV is that next frontier that's going to really bring branding dollars into the mix. Second is the importance of that offline attribution data. It's going to really open up how we think about closed loop reporting and being able to tie online ad exposure to offline sales. In-store digital media, these are massive audiences. It's not just foot traffic. These are audiences, media audiences that are happening in stores, contextually relevant environments. And that it has a lot of opportunity to open up how we think about the physical world, the 3D world, in driving a lot more commerce media. And the last one, commerce media itself, is, as I mentioned, expanding this opportunity into new sectors that represent a huge percentage of digital ad spending and really traditional media spending that I think is going to help unlock the next big pool of advertising dollars into the future. And with that, I will pass it back to Paul.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Andrew. Before we get to your questions live, we're now joined by Brian Gleason, Chief Revenue Officer at Criteo. Thanks again for being here, Brian. So let's dive into some questions, and I'd like to start with a broad one. Brian, how does Criteo look at commerce media?
Hey, Paul, thank you. That was great information that Andrew shared. Many of those things is the focus that Andrew discusses where we play in terms of where Criteo, the value we bring to clients. You know, the first of which starts with our 20,000 direct-to-consumer brands. And, you know, that's not an area that we think around on the monetization side. But for those D2C brands, it is. You know, they're looking for a commerce growth engine, and that's really the backbone of where Criteo started. We then evolved and back in 2016 got into retail media. And when we look at retail media, our ambition is to be the ad stack for retail media. And that's really about the enablement for retailers to do all the things you just talked about. How do they set up? How do they work? How do they bill? How do they look at inventory management? And the last one's the most exciting one, which is once you have these new media opportunities, How do you open that up to the brands? And how do you provide a connection point for brands and shoppable moments outside of the walled gardens? And that's where we see the massive unlock. It was a thing that I think that Andrew touched on his last slide. That could be anywhere. Search, digital, connected television, it's just massive.
So how can ad tech commerce players convince brands that are hesitant to dip their toes into retail media and basically convince them that commerce media is actually worthwhile?
I don't think there's much convincing. When you look at it, if you look at the three major platforms, whether it be Google, Meta, or Amazon, they all provide one thing, which is performance. And when you're thinking about brands want to think about how effective they can spend their media dollars. And there's no better place to understand that than at the point of the transaction. And that's really what we're talking about with commerce media. It's really the transaction and how I can understand and enter those conversations in the most appropriate way. And that's what brands want. I think, though, for brands, and we'll probably talk about this in a little bit, the challenge is, how do you go from 3 DSPs to 6 DSPs? Even within our portfolio alone, we have over 110 retailers around the world, and they range from everything from Shipt to, we recently signed Flipkart, to Target, Bloomingdale's, Nordstrom's, a wide variety of different retailers. So I think there's a massive unlock, but the challenge is find the most appropriate place for brands. But measurement's the key. There's no better measurement. And we think about the changes in our marketplace, and you guys alluded to it earlier with the impact on both Google and Facebook. Those dollars will flow to retail media simply because of the measurement and the first-party data aspect.
And how does the commerce media approach vary between retailers, brands, and D2C brands?
It's different, depending on what you do. We're all looking for the same thing. If you're a D2C brand, you have a digital storefront, and you're looking for two things, which is how do I acquire new customers or bring them into my store? And how do I retain the ones that I have? And what's the best use of media to do that? If you're thinking about retail media, this is a massive new monetization opportunity. We saw the influx of e-commerce over the pandemic, which the challenge here, just because you go that way, it's not an easy transition. You have an increase in cost, whether it be shipping, whether it be inventory management, all those things to contend for. So how do you pay for it? And I think if we look at that, retail media has been at the center of that because, number one, it allows an interaction and a better customer experience for your brands at the point of discovery, but it's also a revenue model that provides a service for the retailers. And for the brands, it's everything we just talked about, which is great. The world's changing. Not only, before it was if 90% of audiences or 99 are shopping in a store, great, I can understand that ecosystem. But suddenly with all these new environments all over the world, how do I make sure that I can represent or get my share the same way that I think about a digital shelf and a physical shelf? How do I get my share of voice on a digital shelf? So all those things are coming to play. And I love the fact that you guys talked about it because I fully agree. It really is the third wave of digital. And we're just at the beginning.
Now, Brian, you come from the agency side. So I'm wondering what trends you're seeing on the buy side in terms of how agencies are approaching this space.
In one respect, it's amazing to see the innovation that they have. The agencies pivoted quite quickly because this was a tidal wave that hit us, in a very short order of time. I think we saw the wave with Amazon, we saw the results, and then suddenly the ecosystem expanded. And if you look at that, each agency is operating a little bit differently. So some, if they're starting from search, they'll expand their search capabilities. Some are building their own e-commerce practices. Some are just independent performance agencies focused on that. But each one of them has the same challenge. How do you go from 6 different access points to 12 different access points to 15? It's not sustainable, to be able to think that we can ask the service side to make it easy. We've got to do it on the technology side. We've got to be able to figure out a way to give them the most efficiency in terms of how we present that data, give them choices in terms of where they play. And also on measurement, if you think about that, I went back to measurement as a high point. If we build these mini walled gardens, right, and those continue to multiply from 1 to 3 to 6 to 15 to 20, you lose the value that we had talked about earlier, right, which is I want to be able to see how effectively I can spend my media dollar. So we have to figure out, we have to make it easier for the agencies. And I think measurement will probably be the one, and I think making an easier access point. And education. We just launched Retail University because there's not a lot out there. And the work that you're doing here and why we're so happy to be a part of it is I think so many people know it's big, but they're not necessarily sure how to best jump in and shape themselves to it.
So from the retailer's point of view, what are the main areas that they should be thinking about when it comes to commerce media?
You can imagine this is a change, right? Because everybody who's sitting in a retailer looks at that Amazon number and goes, I want that, right? I want to have that access. But each retailer is set up differently. The first thing you have to think about, first and foremost, for each one of them is, what is a customer experience? Because if you disrupt the customer experience, it's all for naught, right? We have to make sure we think about that. The second thing is think about your business and what just as a media owner would think, what's the supply that I have? Where do I want to allow access points, whether that's with sponsored ads or whether that's display on my own site? And in doing that, you have to go down the path, which is thinking, okay, there's three ways which you can run this business. One of which is a self-service model, which you're going to build the technology, you're going to build the sales team, you're going to build the marketing team, the billing team, and the list goes on and on. I think there would be very few players who want to own all of it. I think the next phase is saying, you know what, I certainly want to own my data. I want to own the CX. I want to think about the trade relationships I have, but I know there's much more. And they'll outsource or they'll look for a technology partner to help them with measurement, with billing, with excess sales, because even for Criteo alone, we've got 1,700 sellers trying to educate those agencies I just talked about. That's a whole nother ballgame. And the last one is, where do you think this business is? How are you going to continue to grow the revenue? For those existing retailers who reach a certain point, I think the challenge then comes, now do I think about connected TV? Now do I think about expanding those revenue models? Do I think about contextual on how I expand out? And you have to put as a retailer, we're asking them to run a retail business and a media business at the same time. And I think that's a challenge, but the opportunity is massive. I think as a retailer, having a clear view is probably the best advice I can in the areas that you want to own, like your data. That's the gold for most of them. How you use that data, how you apply that data, I think that's the next step.
And just quickly, Brian, before we jump into the live Q&A, what experiences should retailers be providing to consumers across that full shopper journey, online and offline?
They should start with, what is a customer experience? When I go to a retail store, I'm looking for discovery, right? I have an affinity with that store, something drew me in. And the easier and the better that you can make that shopping experience, the better for me. And I think of a store like Nordstrom, right, which is amazing customer service, and there's a plenty else like that. We should do the same thing wherever we travel with that retailer. We live in with that consumer. We live in a world now where I think we're trained to see, click, and buy, but that has to be a very authentic relationship in terms of, if you try to introduce a brand at the inappropriate time in a conversation, think about how we think about TV. If it becomes oversaturated, we don't want to deal with it. The same was true with digital when we abused it early on and showed too many ads. You have to think about the customer experience first and foremost and put yourself in that seat, and then think what's the most appropriate way to introduce brands, and then make sure you have a very easy way for them to buy. And that goes into nothing worse than shipping it and clicking on a product and it's not available. So it's a lot of thought that goes into it. And I think you have to think of each different angle.
Great. Well, thank you, Brian. So now let's go to the audience Q&A. We've gotten a lot of great questions. So let me start here. Which companies, Andrew, do you think have the biggest potential in commerce media?
Yeah, I guess I'd start off with the ones that have the offline sales footprint. That is, to me, the kind of biggest lever of opportunity. So that would be Walmart, Kroger as two of the biggest retailers right now. Instacart, even though they're digital, I think they're kind of representing those sales that are happening in store across hundreds and hundreds of grocery chains. So I'd maybe start there. But there's some other interesting opportunities that are bubbling up. I think about Shopify. After Amazon, Shopify is really seeing the most transaction volume, and they're seeing it across a lot of categories. So that's one that to me could be a sleeping giant. And then if you really want to get creative, I would say auto is a massive category, and nothing's really been tapped into yet from the commerce media standpoint. Who could be a big player there? Well, Carvana just entered into our top 10 e-commerce companies of all time. So they're seeing a lot of searching behavior and transactions. Maybe that can tap into the auto market in a new way.
Any concern that different commerce platforms' data will be too thin to monetize beyond search?
From my standpoint, absolutely. Brian could probably speak better to this, but Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is once you get past the handful of biggest players, if there's not enough depth of information or they're not seeing across enough buying activity, then yeah, it does get thin. So it doesn't mean that an individual transaction isn't valuable, but it becomes valuable to the extent it can be leveraged with other data to round out a picture of a consumer. It's all about targeting and measurement. So you do need that data depth. Yeah, so this is why I think the market has to start to move towards more of that aggregation of first-party data. I think all privacy compliant and anonymized, obviously, but how can you leverage those things in one place?
Yeah, I would agree with Andrew. And I think the challenge is data in isolation is irrelevant in most cases, right? It's the application of that data. But I think you have to be very thoughtful to think, okay, how big is the data asset that I have and who is it meaningful to? In your own environment, it's certainly valuable. Once you begin to extend beyond that, that's where I think the value drops very, very quickly because it's just a point solution for us. We see nearly 4 billion SKUs a day in terms of SKUs overall that we're seeing at $100 trillion a transaction. It's a massive footprint. And even we're continuously looking for more. So if you're a small portion of that, it's very difficult to get scale or meaningful scale.
Andrew, why isn't Amazon's retail media ad share declining over the next few years with so many new RMNs popping up, retail media networks?
Yeah, I mean, I think for all the ways that we expect retail media to evolve in the next few years, Amazon is at the head of the curve on those dimensions. So they're well aligned for the market growth and to basically more or less maintain their position. Yes, there's a lot more competition. Some of the other players, the second tier players, I think will start to accelerate a bit more and gain share. But yeah, I don't see anything that's going to fundamentally unseat Amazon's position in the near term. And one big asset that they have that is really not an asset yet, but it will be, or if you think out 2 or 3 years, it's physical store footprint, right? Amazon Fresh stores are just now starting to scale. That's picking up steam. Once they get that visibility into offline sales, and those stores are going to be built from the ground up to capture that CPG brand buying activity, that's something that really well aligns them for the future.
And I don't think it's either or, right, Andrew? It's not Amazon or the other retailers. It's not the way the world works. So it has to be additive to that, that's what I think we're seeing. So Amazon will continue to scale, and you can see the things they're innovating, whether it's Twitch, whether it's now what's the new name, Free TV. So yeah, Free TV. So I mean, they're going to continue to do that. It's not either or, and in many ways, that helps retail media in general because it shows the performance value that we talked about in the beginning. I think the leverage on the other side is how quickly can other retailers get into the game? How quickly can they stand up their operation? And how can they look to, at some point, a measurement over the top of each one of them? What do those relationships look like? But to your point, we're in the early innings. So I think there's a lot more that you'll see. And I don't think it's either or. I think it helps the whole category. Yeah,
when we think about market share, it almost turns it into a zero-sum game. As I mentioned before, in the next 3 years, we expect this market to double, another $30 billion just over a 3-year period, right? Everybody can gain in that environment.
I liked when Paul was talking earlier about $10 billion chunks like they were Tic Tacs. 10 billion here, 10 billion there.
Funny you mentioned that, Brian, because we did get a couple of questions from the audience that are sort of clarifying questions. Andrew, you did mention that retail media will be, I think it was $60 billion market by 2024. And our audience is wondering if that factors in the 31 billion in revenue that Amazon just reported.
Yeah, so the current market today, Amazon reported about 31 billion. Now that's global. So their actual US number, I think, is in our forecast something closer to about 21 billion. Yeah, so we factor in, and I will say, shout out to our forecast team who was on the money. Amazon just broke out the numbers, so now we know for certain, but I think their forecast, I want to say, was 31.5 billion and it ended up being 31.2 billion. So they were very, very close to the mark. We just adjusted our forecast with respect to that. But yes, it absolutely takes into account Amazon as the biggest piece.
Great. And this will be the last question we have time for today. What is the next frontier for retail media networks? How will they attempt to differentiate from one another?
I love some of the points of differentiation with what the creativity that they're applying, like GoPuff and product sampling. And I think Instacart's also going to get into that. So to me, that's like layering in a whole new piece of the advertising mix. It's not just advertising, but you can then actually trial the product and then be able to measure the uptake on that product over time into the future. To me, like that's a marketing analyst's dream to be able to understand that component. That's a great point of differentiation. I think they have to lean into their relative strengths. I mentioned some of them, that those relative strengths are maybe they have a large offline footprint. Maybe they have a ton of foot traffic in their stores and they can really make the most of their in-store media experiences. All of these retailers have real strengths. Sometimes it's that they go more narrow and they're focused on a specific category. We found in some of our research that the brands who are using Best Buy and Home Depot's media networks, even though maybe they're not as big as some of the others, they like them. They think they're doing a good job because it's very tailored to their needs. So I think there's plenty of opportunity for each one. They just need to lean into what their competitive advantages are.
Any closing thoughts, Brian?
No, I would agree. I think it goes back to that ability to provide closed loop measurement. Like, so we're focusing on the digital environment. We still haven't connected to in-store. So you can imagine an ecosystem where you have in-store data connected to your digital environment that then extends offline. That's amazing. And when we think about the deprecation of the third-party cookie, that is going to become absolute gold, right? Because it'll be the only defining measurement that we can see in many ways, and it'll be the one that's closest to transaction data. I think that's why we see this commerce data as commerce media as the third wave.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you again to Andrew for joining us, and a very special thanks to Brian and to the team at Criteo. Our eMarketer production crew behind the scenes also deserves a huge thank you for making this webinar possible. As promised, we'll be emailing you soon with a link to the slides and the full recording. Now, before we wrap up, I'd like to take a moment to tell you what's happening across eMarketer's media channels. You can register for upcoming live analyst and tech talk webinars at emarketer.com/webinars. On the audio side, please tune in to Behind the Numbers, eMarketer's daily podcast at emarketer.com/podcast. And finally, please check out our newsletters. Again, thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your workday.